I will go ahead and just introduce our first speaker today. She is Drema Gross. She's actually my boss at the Water Conservation Division. She'll be talking about drought update. Drema?
Hi, y'all. Everybody awake? Get some coffee? Didn't bring it in here? Got your cell phones off? Because you want to make sure that you're not the person that I hear the ringtone and I make you get up and do a little dance? All right. So we're here to talk about the drought. How many of you think it's over? Raise your hands. Aw, we love an education. How many of you think we're still in a drought? How many of you think this is a completely new and possibly permanent situation for Central Texas? All right, so let's talk a little bit about what our current situation is, and then we'll talk some about what the city is doing to try to address it and what we can expect going forward. Just so you know, Austin Water, we are 100% reliant on the Lower Colorado River. It's managed by LCRA, the Lower Colorado River Authority, and we have firm water rights. We can take up to 325,000 acre-feet into the future. They're supposed to provide that much out of firm storage. We also have our own run-of-river rights, which means it's a senior water right. We're, I think, the second in the state in terms of first in time, first in right. We've prepaid for that water up to 201,000 acre-feet, which means that until we hit that point, we don't have to keep paying LCRA every year or per acre foot or how much we draw. The city of Austin, back in 1999, worked out this deal for $100 million, and let me tell you, it has served us very, very well. There's a lot of places, Las Vegas, California, that have to go out and find new water, truck it in, or pay somebody for raw water rights, and we are not in that situation here. We also don't get anything from the Barton Springs Edwards Aquifer, nothing from the Trinity right now. We are entirely dependent on surface water, which means we're also dependent on LCRA and how they manage that water. The good news is we have been able to reduce our draw in the lakes. Back in 2009 or so, we were taking about 170,000 acre-feet per year. Last year, we took 136. So even though our population is growing, we are managing our water better, and what that means is we're going to extend the time before we end up having to pay more for LCRA, and that's one of the biggest ways we can keep water rates low. We're a big utility. We've got 200,000 connections out there. We're approaching 1 million people in our service area. We've got 1,100 employees, and we are providing a service that is always on. It's always reliable. You flush your toilet, that goes away, and it's clean to a point that our downstream conditions are rated higher in the TCEQ than the ones upstream. So we've got a lot going on. It's a big utility, but again, our water supply right now is completely surface water, which means if we don't get that in the reservoirs and if we don't have rain that's making the lakes or the river flow, then we could potentially be in a trouble spot. And we've seen that in the last few years. Y'all know what this picture is, right? This is Lake Travis only a few months ago. And you can see how far down the lakes were. At the lowest point, I think they got down to about 36% full combined storage in Travis and Buchanan. And right now they're back up to about 70, which is great. It's wonderful. It's still not full. And there's still a lot of summer left. You can see all of these boat docks, everything that was out of the water didn't just impact our water uses like for landscaping, but it had a big impact on recreation in the area. And we saw this for continued years. It's great that now you can get boats back out on the lake. It's great that those businesses that rely on lake views and are starting to see a resurgence, customers coming back because it's a nice place to be. We want to keep it that way. So is the drought over? You guys agreed with me. Rainfall totals. This year, just from January to June, just let's look at historical, this period. We had a lot. Memorial Day floods. Where do you guys think we're going to rank? Like, you know, out of the last 50 years, we're This period was, who thinks it's the wettest period in the 50-year history? Who thinks it's in the top 10? Who thinks it's in the top 25? We're not the highest. We're not even in the top 10. It was the 33rd wettest. So you think all that rain that came in, and it's still nothing compared to the historical stuff that we've seen since the dams and the lakes were built back in the 40s. So the current drought from 2008 forward, which is pretty much how we're marking it, has 6 of the 10 lowest inflow years. And the inflows are when the watershed basins come flowing in through creeks and rivers to the Highland Lakes and to Travis and Buchanan. So it's a lot of stuff that's further northwest of Austin specifically. And what we've seen is that the water just isn't, it might be falling, but it's not getting into the lakes. And we think there's a lot of things that could be happening. It could be that the soil is so dry and hard that it's just soaking up and we're not having enough runoff that's going into the lakes. It could be the timing of the lake events or the rain events, and it could be exactly where the water's falling. So, one thing we've seen is there's a meridian that moves across the United States, and it's slowly traveling from west to east, where on one side of it, rainfall totals are very, very low. On the other side of it, rainfall totals are 30 inches or more. And what we've seen is over time, that looks like it's starting to shift eastward. And until the last couple of years, it also looks like it ran right through the center of town, which explains why sometimes the west half of Austin doesn't get a lot of water, but the east half does. And that may be permanent. It may not be. It may just be one thing that we're seeing because we're looking for something to explain this. But I think the important thing to note is that despite the recent rains, we are still in a hydrologic drought. We have been in drought for so long now that it's been more intense than the historic drought of the 50s. LCRA won't declare it the drought worse than the drought of record until it is all over, but we are on track to hit that goal. This is a way to kind of see how far we're behind in terms of cumulative inflows. That black line, the top line, is what it looked like in the 50s, from the drought to the time that the lakes recovered. So they had months since the start of the drought where they had very low rainfall, and then it kind of kept going up, and it went up pretty steadily. We've had longer time in that red line without the rain and without the inflows coming in. The Memorial Day floods are just that little tail sticking up right there on the end. So it gives you an idea of how little that impact had on the cumulative drought, the cumulative deficit that we've had in our inflows. Here's another way of looking at it. That May yellow spike, 2015, huge. And it was way more than average for that month. But look at where the other yellow bars are. That darkest one on the far left of each month, that's the average. Over 40 years, 50 or over 60 years, that's the average. And then when you see the last 5 years, you can see how much lower than average we've been almost every single month, year in and year out. And it's pretty devastating. Yet another way of looking at it, on a short history period, you can see this is our cyclical, and this is starting in 2005, in case you can't read the tiny, tiny print in the screen. Starting in January of 2005, going up through January of 15, or June of 15, because that's where we've got our data through. You can see the natural tendencies and swings. Those big dips are generally agricultural releases. Since 2011, we haven't had any big agricultural releases. That was the last year that water went to downstream users, which is largely rice farming. And so it's kind of flattened out. There haven't been any more huge drops. But you can see that now the Memorial Day flood brought us back up, but not even close to being full in the lakes. Same graph, longer time span. Let's look at the historical trends of what's going on. This one goes back to 1989, and you can see that pattern of a lot of rain filling up the lakes and then a lot of it coming out as downstream use has that need. A lot of rain to fill it back up, And then you can see how different this recent drought is from that historical pattern. Let's take it back even further. And the lines get a lot more compressed, but you can see those two really big drops back in the 1950s and then again in the 1960s. They had pretty short or pretty tall spikes coming after them, which indicates a quick refilling of the lakes, at least in this long horizon. And you can see that our little bump here isn't anywhere close to the kind of bumps that they got to come out of those droughts of the 50s. So fortunately, you guys all came in convinced that the drought was still in place. Here's some more evidence, and this is why we are continuing in Austin Water and frankly throughout the city to prioritize how we manage our water supplies. So as we go forward, we are proceeding with caution. As I said, the rainfall that we're getting is not always translating into inflows. What we need is several days in a row of hard, steady, consistent rain, and that's what seems to be filling up the lakes. LCRA has a water management plan. It's approved by TCEQ. They're currently operating under what they call the 2010 Water Management Plan, which was originally submitted in, I think, 2003, and it took 7 years to be approved. So it has a lot of really old data about how the lakes work. That 2010 Water Management Plan would govern when LCRA is required to release water downstream, when it's required to cut back firm water customers. Firm water customers are those who can get water regardless, unless we're in a pro rata curtailment, drought worse than drought of record situation. The interruptible water customers are only supposed to get water in the lakes if we've got extra. And up until 2011, that was the case. So from 2012 through this year, LCRA has had to petition TCEQ to get emergency relief. And what that means is permission to deviate from the water management plan and not release it, not release that water. Now, even as the 2010 plan was being adopted, which was really the submitted in 2003 plan, LCRA and its stakeholders were working hard on a new plan to incorporate more updated water modeling. And then even after these last few years of drought, when we saw that we're seeing some of the lowest inflow years on record happening one right after the other, they've extended the hydrology. It's still pending at TCEQ. TCEQ reviewed it, sent it back to LCRA with some revisions that they wanted to see made, but it is still not what governs the water use in the Highland Lakes. We're hopeful that it will be, and that it will be a much better situation for all of the firm customers around Central Texas, which includes Austin, as well as Cedar Park, some places in Horseshoe Bay, all the way up there. We don't know yet whether or not this is a typical pattern or this is a permanent climate shift. You saw the cyclical nature of how the lakes fill and refill, but we don't know yet whether or not this is going to be just, a standard 50-year history, or whether this is going to be something where we've actually seen a change and we can't get back up to where we expected to be. LCRA has already used this modeling information to reduce what they call their firm yield, which is the amount of water they have available to sell to firm water customers. And they've reduced it by 100,000 acre-feet. Now, that means sort of the extra, and they believe they had some extra lying around. It doesn't affect the city of Austin. It doesn't affect anybody who already has a contract. But it means they have a lot less water to sell. In fact, I think they've got somewhere in the neighborhood of 50,000 acre-feet that isn't already committed out of the Highland Lakes. And that, to me, is a worrisome situation. This is a graph that LCRA posts about every month that gives an estimate of, given really dry conditions or really wet conditions, what we might see happening in the lakes. And what you can see is all the way out through January of next year, we don't expect those lakes to be full, even in the best case scenario. Down on the 99 percentile level, the 1% condition or the 5% condition, we can see those staying just around 1.2 million acre-feet of combined storage. That's what we expect all the way out to January. Obviously, this is a bar that keeps moving, and they update it every month with new data. But I put it up here to give you a sense of fact that even though we've had these rains, we're not expecting those lakes to fill right back up. It would take another historic drought or historic flood event for that to happen. So what the City of Austin has been doing, we've been trying to manage through this drought, knowing that the reservoirs have been between 36% or so for the last 5 years. We've really heavily invested in our reclaimed water because that's a drought-proof supply for us. That's when we take treated wastewater effluent and we rechlorinate it and send it through purple pipes to industrial, commercial users in the system. You can use it for landscape watering, you can use it for air conditioning, cooling, and some buildings use it for toilet flushing. There's been a lot of consumer interest in rainwater and gray water, and that's we've got speakers lined up here to talk to you about what the City of Austin allows and promotes in those areas. And we've seen from our consumers that they are willing overall to sacrifice their lawns as long as they can protect the trees. That's what we've heard from public input processes that we've had. And so we've done things like distribute these tree gators, which is an irrigation bag for newly planted trees that you can see there. And so as long as it's a pretty small diameter tree, you can make sure that tree is getting the water that it needs without violating any watering restrictions. And we've changed our codes so that we encourage bubblers and drip irrigation and soaker hoses around trees and allow those to go on much further into the drought than we do sprinkling of grass landscapes. We've moved to an administrative enforcement process on our water use restrictions. We've been in 1 day a week since 2011, almost consistently. There was a little 6-week break. But we've been in 1 day a week watering, and we've seen remarkable compliance. But part of the reason is we still do have folks who go out and patrol. We follow up on reports that we get, and we have folks who just drive around at 2 in the morning and catch you when you're not watering on your day. And some people think that that's aggressive, and it is, because it's important that if we're asking one person to hold to these standards, that we apply it to everyone. One thing that we did change in 2012 was we went from taking people to court when we found them to violate the ordinance to putting a fine on the bill. And that way it was a lot more manageable for our staff, and it was a quicker signal we could send to someone to say, hey, we're not going to let this keep going. And what we've seen as a result is we haven't collected all that much money. We've collected some, which is great. But we've seen that after the first fine, repeated fines drop way off, and especially in residential customers, which is the bulk of our water use. We see in sometimes commercial customers, it takes a couple fines before they kind of stop that use. And some of that has to do with the management being out of state in some of those cases. It takes a while for them to get the message all the way down. But we are continuing to enforce, and we are seeing improved compliance. And so both of those things are really helpful in making sure we're not wasting the water we have. We've already saved, if you remember from the beginning, I said that we were using 136,000 acre-feet of water. We believe that our drought restrictions have lowered what we would have used by 76,000 acre-feet. You can add that to 104,000 acre-feet that we've been saving from all of the conservation programs we've had over the years. And those are numbers that we worked with LCRA and some statistical analysis companies to do an econometric analysis of how much we would have been using if we hadn't gone all out on replacing toilets, having aggressive pricing structures, incentivizing clothes washers and other efficient equipment, incentivizing changes to landscapes and drip irrigation. We would have used 180,000 more. That's about, that's 180,000 acre-feet a year that we would have been using. Actually, this is cumulative, but that's 180,000 acre-feet. In 2011, that release to the rice farmers was 400,000 acre-feet. We used last year 136,000 acre-feet. I say those numbers, and I say them dramatically, because I think it's important to note that the City of Austin has a limited ability to affect how much water is in the lakes. And we're doing as much as we can to make sure that the water we have stays in those lakes. But we, at least prior to 2012, were not by far the biggest user of the water in those lakes. We are the biggest municipal user, and we're the biggest user now because of the emergency relief that we've been getting. But we're also the leader in our area in terms of aggressive policies to incentivize conservation and to mandate responsible water use. Some of our programs, many of you have heard of these before, but we kind of focus on 6 different areas. We've got incentives. They're gradually decreasing in focus because we've gotten a lot of the low-hanging fruit. And so we're working with some advisory committees as well as our own staff to take a look at what's out there that we haven't tapped. We're using the drought to really capitalize on education, and I think it's working. When I asked, are we out of the drought, not a single one of you, yeah, you realized it was a baited question, but not a single one of you raised your hands. And I think that's because we've been doing a better job of educating people about the drought and getting the media to talk about it. Our regulation has been increasing in importance over time, especially as those incentives start to go away. What we found is that by putting things in code, by making it more likely that new development will have efficient equipment inside the building and efficient landscaping outside, that's really what's going to transform the city's water use over time. We do have very, very strong pricing signals on the residential side. There are consequences. It makes it difficult to have a stable revenue stream to operate the business of the utility. We still provide the ability to turn on your tap, whether or not you choose to turn it on. And so that's something that, it's a lot less dependent on how much you use and on just the ability to use it when you want to. And so that's something in our pricing structures we have to take a look at. Are we fairly charging for water and sending a conservation price signal? Our reuse is growing. By the time there's a build out of the system, we'll be using, we expect, 5.5 billion gallons per year. Right now we hover around 1.5, and it kind of depends. We actually see our reuse go down when we have been in drought, because even though that's a drought-proof water supply, even though it's exempt from our restrictions, we see those customers cutting back too, because they're starting to realize that all water is important. Operationally, we've saved probably close to 80 million gallons a year in operational efficiencies, getting to leaks faster, repairing some of the worst pipes in our system so that those aren't leaking, and looking at ways to tighten up water loss and make sure that everything is accounted for. Some of the things you guys might be aware of or interested in, we have a landscape conservation rebate. We've worked with the Grow Green team in the Watershed Development Group to come up with templates that give you some ideas on different scenarios, deer-resistant, child-friendly, poolside, shade-tolerant landscapes that can qualify for rebates when you're tearing out healthy grass and putting in drought-tolerant plants. And Chris Charles runs that program for us, the gentleman who introduced me, and has plenty more information for anybody who's not familiar with it. For new development, one of the things that I'm so proud of is that in this last year, we've worked with the home builders, and it's taken longer than just this last year. But in the last year, the Home Builders Association has worked with us and the LCRA and some other interest groups to come up with this sensible landscaping for Central Texas guide. And what it is a site-specific guideline that they expect all new home builders who are part of the HBA to use. So when a new development or a neighborhood goes in, they are planning to offer this as the standard landscape package. That it's not going to be throw in the St. Augustine on the front, leave the back bare. It's going to be something that is well thought out and is appropriate for that specific site. We've also got other things. Commercial development has to hook up to Reclaim Now. We're working on looking at mandating that you recapture AC condensate from cooling towers. And we're working with the Code Next folks and all of the landscape design criteria manual changes to try to make sure that we have codes that work hand in hand in terms of what we require on the irrigation side and what they require on the plant and design side. Again, I've talked about the water use restrictions. Even if we were to go back and release them, it's never going to be more than twice a week. We were one of the first, I think, to make that permanent, and I know Dallas has followed our lead in that area. We prohibit water waste and change those up as we need when we have more severe drought conditions, as we've seen lately. We now require every 2 years that large commercial landscapes get an irrigation evaluation. And they have to submit that information to us. And it's not only helping us make sure that they're in compliance, but it's getting those property managers used to taking a look at their system on a regular basis. And they've got to have that operating in compliance and show that they've made those changes before they can turn that system back on. We've got certifications for car washes, and as I said before, we do issue fines. They've gotten a lot smaller than they used to be. It used to be, $175 plus court costs, and now it's, they'll start at $50, depending on what stage we're in. As I mentioned before, as soon as we give that first violation, that first fine, which is already after a warning, the recurrence goes way down. And we haven't had any overturned that have gone through the full appeals process. So our staff's doing a great job of making sure that we're giving everybody a chance to comply and making sure we have our documentation in place. We're going to remain in stage 2 for the rest of the summer. And the utility is considering, as you may have seen if you saw the memo from the city manager to mayor and council, whether or not we should be in once a week permanently. So that's not an immediate change. That's not anything that's not going to happen without a lot of public discussion. We anticipate being on the September agenda for the Public Utilities Committee, which is the subcommittee of council that oversees Austin water operations. And their feedback on this idea is going to determine what the timeline is. But we anticipate going through something very similar to what we did in 2012, where we have a series of meetings, we talk to a number of boards and commissions, and we get everybody's thoughts on what is right for Austin, what puts us in the best position for our LCRA contract and for protecting the water supplies that we have, and also what can people who use water live with? What is a reasonable restriction? We also have an integrated water resource plan that's in progress. It's going to be a 2-year process. We're bringing in outside consultants to help look at all of the city's water needs and all of our potential supply, looking at both the supply side and the demand side conservation efforts to try to see what's the right plan for the city for the next 50 or 100 years forward. How can we take better advantage of rainfall? How can we integrate gray water and design elements better? And there's going to be a lot of smart brains, and we have a citizens task force of 11 folks who are interested and involved in these industries who are going to help guide that process. So we have added drought rates, and I've talked about a lot of our water use. Most of our customers right now, water use is subsidized. We are not actually charging everyone what it costs to bring water to your door. But what we have done is really divorce demand and population. That red line is Austin's population up through 2014. And the blue line is how much water we've used in in million gallons. This is our per capita per day. You can see how much it's gone down. We had a goal that was set in 2010 to reach 140 gallons per capita per day by 2020. Well, here it is, 2015, and we came in last year at 125. And that's our staff, and it's the citizens responding and understanding how important this is. So with that, I'm here to answer questions. And just so you know, this is how cheap our water is. Yes, ma'am.
Is there any consideration for edible landscapes?
One of the questions that was asked, in case you couldn't hear it, is there any consideration for edible landscapes? And what I will say is that we have allowed drip irrigation to continue with no restrictions all the way up through stage 3. And so as long as those landscapes are set up to use that water efficiently, and in most cases our understanding is that that would be the case, then you can use drip as you need to on those types of plants. And so that's something that's built into the code. You don't have to get a variance or a waiver. It's just, if you're using drip or soaker hoses, those can continue. Yes. So for those of you who didn't hear, we do have an alternative compliance for vegetable gardens. We worked with, I think, the Sustainable Food Policy Board and the Office of Sustainability to do that. You can apply online. Is that one on our website at Boston Water, or is that something else? Okay. Community Gardens, Food Portal, austintexas.gov/food. And that's something that we set up a few years ago in terms of, especially when there's something other than drip needed for shared community gardens and things like that. So we are trying to be sensitive to people who are growing something other than grass or pavement to make sure that water can be responsibly used. Denise? Sure. Denise asked if there's a variance for landscape contractors and installations, and there is, to establish new landscapes. We have a standard variance that's really only available when we're in our conservation or stage 1. It's not available in a stage 2 drought, and that allows 30 days in 10-day increments. It's a declining scale. So you get 10 days of watering every day, 10 days of watering every other day, 10 days of watering every 3 days, and then you have to follow the schedule that's in place. During stage 2, the only variance that's allowed for you is what we call our xeriscape variance, which allows the establishment of drought-tolerant plants, and you have 40 days to do that. And it's also meant to encourage things like habiturf. There is a possibility on that one that we'll consider an application for renewal if needed based on the temperatures and the conditions. And we worked with our home builders and our development agencies to try to make those concessions so that we were getting in good landscapes that could withstand the drought, giving them adequate resources to survive and be established, and not holding down or holding back folks from getting a mortgage on a new house or messing with contracts that had come up for home builders because they weren't able to get those approved for mortgages if they didn't have installed landscaping. And that's what we were seeing happen back in 2012. Sorry, and that's that.
Your program with the sensible landscapes for home builders and homeowners, do you have any programs or anything in place for the LAs that are designing those landscapes?
So the question was whether or not we have anything in place for the landscape architects who are developing the sensible landscapes. And I want to clarify, that is actually the home builders guideline. It's their standard. And we're working now, again, with HBA and LCRA to try to come up with some trainings. And we're really hoping to do those, I think, both on an architect level and also on an installer level. I personally would really like to see them provided in English and Spanish. But that is not something that's been developed right now. I would encourage you to contact the Home Builders Association and make it clear that that's something that you're looking for. I think we have time for one more. Yes, ma'am.
Stage 4 water restrictions, from what I understand, that means no outside irrigation. Is that correct?
Yes. She asked whether stage 4 means no outside irrigation. And with very, very few exceptions, that is the case.
Okay. And so stage 2 is twice a week. So what's stage 3?
No, ma'am. Stage 2 is once per week. Okay. Stage 3 is also once per week, but the hours are reduced. And we also don't let you fill spas. You can still refill a pool because if you can't put water in a pool, it will crack and cause leaks. But you can stop refilling a spa. There's a couple of other small things. But really what it is trying to condense the hours and get people to cut back through a smaller percentage.
Okay. Well, my point there is that you go from stage 2 that's once a week to stage 3 that's still once a week with limited hours. And then bam, you go to stage 4 with no water. It seems to me stage 3 should maybe be like twice a month.
So,
you know what I'm saying? It's
right.
back to the plans to be more prepared because, anyone that irrigates twice a week after your landscape is established is wasting water. I have many clients that they just water once a month.
Sure. So I don't know if anyone could hear, but the question was about whether stage 3 should actually be every other week or there should be something else. And we did consider that as we were looking at a potential stage 3 condition. We were looking at what happens next. And we had a Water Resources Committee that had asked us to go and take a look at maybe a stage 3.5 that would be an every other week, or hand watering only, or some other thing to kind of ease us into a no water use restriction. And what's happened with that is about the same time that, in fact, we had a memo about it summarizing the public opinion that we got from some meetings and ready to incorporate that. We had it at City Hall, and they were reviewing it around the time of the Memorial Day floods. And that sort of changed our landscape picture. We knew that stage 3 wasn't quite imminent, and we felt like there was still some work to be done. And now, as we're taking a look at, hey, maybe we should begin once a week permanently, what we're going to do is hold off on all of that until we can get to a point where we're having a larger public discussion. We don't want to start making tiny changes to the code. We're not imminently facing that situation now, and we'd much rather take a look at the whole thing and come up with a holistic approach that works. In the 2012 code revisions that made stage 3 a shorter hour window, previously stage 3 had been the no watering outdoors. What we wanted to do was figure out a way to put off all of the really harsh restrictions until absolute emergency conditions, where we're talking about maybe not even having enough drinking water. And that was something that we felt pretty strongly that our restrictions up through stage 3 were going to be enough so that we would never have to go into stage 4. That's the ideal condition. So that stage 4 isn't something you do because of drought, it's something you do because one of your water plants has come offline, and you do it for a couple of weeks, that would be, the only use of those restrictions. But again, September, we're coming back to the PUC. Given their feedback, we'll determine what our timeline is for taking a look at all of this. We also want to fit it in with the Integrated Water Resource Plan. They're going to be doing some climate modeling and some other information about modeling the hydrology of the lake, so we have a better understanding of how much water we're going to have available. And then we can factor that into how we rewrite our water use management code. And with that, I think I'm over time. So, thanks.
Thank you, Drema.